Di dalamku ku kan menari seperti dat menari. Bila roh Allah ada di dalamku ku kan menari seperti dat menari. Ku kan menari, ku kan menari.
Welcome everyone, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you happen to be. We're very excited today to be welcoming participants from all over the world. We've had registrations for this webinar from not only from North America, but also from South America and Asia, and also from Europe. So we're really happy to have a really international gathering today to consider the important topic that's before us. My name is Mike McMahon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hymn Society of the United States and Canada. And this is part of our webinar series called The World Sings, in preparation for our centennial celebration coming up this summer here in Washington, D.C. So we're really happy today to be welcoming Dr. Becca Whitla, who is Professor of Pastoral Studies at St. Andrew's College in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where she teaches worship and liturgy, preaching, and religious education. She recently published a book called Liberation, Decoloniality, and Liturgical Practices, subtitled Flipping the Songbird. And she is going to speak to us today on the issue of decolonizing worship. So there's going to be time for questions at the end. So if you want to put your questions into the Q&A box, you'll find the button for at the bottom of your screen. Brian Hain is behind the scenes, and he's going to curate those questions, and he'll pop on at the end to present those questions to Becca. So thank you, Becca, for being with us.
Hello, everybody. It's really great to be here. I'm so excited, and to tell you the truth, a little bit nervous too. I just want to say that much of this material comes out of the research that I did for my book. So if you get curious, I encourage you to get a copy of it. And also just to say that the handout that I prepared for today is not exhaustive. It doesn't have everything in it, but it just points you to a few things that I thought might be of interest if you get curious and want to do some further research on your own. So without further ado, I'll start. I was just telling Mike that the presentation is about 62 minutes long. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, and let's get going. I begin today with a land acknowledgement. I speak to you from Toronto, Canada, traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I also live in Saskatoon, about 3,000 kilometers from here, in Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. This is the South Saskatchewan River. These two places are now home for many nations from across the Americas and around the world. We in Canada and the USA, the land some call Turtle Island, have been invited to share land in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Indeed, Abya-Yala, Atzlan, and Turtle Island, what we call the Americas, have been places of great activity for thousands of years, where Indigenous peoples have been caretakers of these lands. But the Americas have been under the shadow of the European conquering and settling of these lands for 500 years, and the heinous physical, cultural, and epistemic violence inflicted upon people groups and the earth since then. My understanding of coloniality, decolonizing, and liberation emerge out of this context. What I've learned after more than 25 years of animating community singing in the church, in the trade union movement, and out in the broader community is that when people gather to sing, they bring their lived experiences with them, representing many cultures, languages, social and economic classes, etc. My response has been to draw on liberationist thinkers as a way to lift up the experience and the cultural traditions of the people as a place for doing theology and for transforming our world as part of a liberating praxis. So a praxis needs to include the recognition, a liberating praxis needs to include the recognition that coloniality remains pervasively operative in our singing and in our liturgies, as well as in life. As a result, for me, a liberating practice of singing in my context includes a commitment to decolonizing. Another way of coming at the question of decolonizing is to ask about the function of songs to express experiences, traditions, knowledges, as well as Christian faith and theology. What makes it possible for some songs, some expressions to be seen as universal and better than others, while others simply don't appear as part of our repertoires? Decolonizing stances can help us analyze these dynamics and interrogate the coloniality in our patterns of worship, in our singing. Latin American decolonial thinkers call this all-encompassing residual web of colonizing processes, tendencies, and practices coloniality. It affects who we are, regulates how we understand the world, and conditions all our relations. It is also built on systems of white supremacy, capitalism, and Christianity, systems which have benefited people like me and our churches. Our hymns and songs are not immune to these processes. Confronting empire in congregational singing requires wrestling with these ongoing impacts of coloniality in Christian worship practices. Broadly speaking, there are three aspects to a decolonizing stance. First, it recognizes and affirms other ways of doing and knowing from the global South and from marginalized contexts in the global North. Akin to the Latin American notion of a preferential option for the poor, excluded or marginalized, this first step affirms that songs rise up and are voiced in the fragile spaces that have already been opened up by those from the underside. This song that I'm going to play now, Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life, comes from the oral tradition of the Black American tradition, and it was published by Guy and Candy Carawan with the same title, Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life. And Kim Harris referred to it in her webinar a couple of months back. The song is being sung here by the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees Local 75 Choir, a choir of Jamaican Canadian hotel workers in downtown Toronto that I had the privilege of working with for many years. Here's a little bit of the song. This affirmation of other ways of ritualizing praying and singing sometimes includes rituals, prayers, and hymns, which might actually appear to be tools of the colonizer at first glance, like Victorian hymns, which are imbued with ideologies of empire in text, music, and performance practice. But such examples of European hymnody can be inverted or flipped by the people who sing them, as they subvert theologies of empire and colonialism through singing. That is what Latin American decolonial scholars name as epistemic disobedience, as expressions of other ways of knowing, thinking, and being, and I would add singing, that point beyond what they call the modern colonial world system. This is the second aspect of a decolonizing stance. It says 1 and 2. I got my numbers a bit mixed up there. So the third aspect of a decolonizing stance in liturgy is an interrogation of the ways in which rituals and hymns do preserve, reproduce, and reinscribe ideologies and theologies of empire in order to expose coloniality in text and music, as well as in leadership practices. This is a fundamental interrogation of our traditions of Christian coloniality in worship. The way we've always done it cannot remain beyond scrutiny. I'm going to unpack each of these three aspects of decolonizing congregational singing. But let's turn to the third task first, by confronting coloniality in hymns. Much of the repertoire and values of the church music inheritance in mainline churches in Canada, and I'm going to kind of focus on Canada here, but the ideas and the thinking are applicable well beyond the Canadian context. So in Canada, along with the rest of the English-speaking world, come from the hymnic traditions of Victorian England. And these hymns have also been translated into Portuguese, to Spanish, to Japanese. I know that we have folks from those different places here today, and so you'll recognize some of them. This hymnody, its text, its music, and its context was enmeshed, coincided with, and became conditioned by the ascendancy of the British Empire, including the conviction that a superior English and later British identity would enlighten, pun intended, and civilize those who became part of the empire. This conviction was bolstered by the construction and then entrenchment of systems of racialized classification, which placed Anglo-Saxons at the top by establishing white supremacy as a key mechanism to enforce colonialism throughout the British Empire. One of the most insidious means of culturally entrenching this superiority and its expansionism was and is through singing. As a result, congregational singing from this inheritance is imbued with coloniality, which perpetuates theologies of empire through glorifications of monarchy, militarism, triumphalism, xenophobia, racial superiority, and patriarchy. Let me use a couple of brief illustrations. The most obvious and painful example of hymnic coloniality, what I call music coloniality, is evident in the hymns that traveled with the British in their imperial and colonial pursuits, 19th century mission-focused hymns. In addition to promoting a theology which had at its heart the view that the superior religious cultural expression known to humanity was emphatically European, these hymns display notions of divine providential chosenness. They are also marked by racialized and gendered language, all of which is endorsed by Christ the King. Here's one example, which displays a missiology where earthly imperial conquest is intertwined with the language of winning and conquering on behalf of God's dominion, along with the doctrine of racial superiority in the name of spreading the gospel from pole to pole. This missionary hymn is filled with the evangelistic tone of its era, which paints the picture of other kingdoms sitting in darkness only to be freed by the glorious light. 100 years later, in 1897, when Britain was in the throes of celebrating its monarch's Diamond Jubilee, the triumph of the British Empire was affirmed in hymns like Arise, O Church of England. The Queen, formally made Empress of India in 1874, the flag and the gospel were interwoven in a celebration of her beneficent and divinely sanctioned gaze. These two obvious examples underscore prevailing attitudes. In most English-speaking Protestant churches, these hymns, replete with racist and imperialist overtones, were standard fare. This vision, of the British Empire, was indivisible from the particular brand of Christianity with which it was enmeshed and which it exported. This quotation, which I won't read out loud, I'll just pause to let you do that, from Dr. John Clifford in his volume, God's Greater Britain, sums up the prevailing attitude. Other examples are perhaps more subtle, but they nonetheless display a coalescence between European and especially English imperial desire and a vision of God's reign flourishing across the globe. Hymns like Isaac Watts's Jesus Shall Reign, written before what Michael Yegasar calls and Stephen Burns call the high noon of the British Empire, articulated Europe's ascendancy and called on other nations, Persia, India, and the unnamed barbarous nations in verse 3, to submit and bow to the Christian Lord. It also characterized heathen lands unflatteringly as being in the darkness or shade of death, soon to be enlightened by what one presumes is a European Christ. These verses are not usually sung today, but the hymn still rings out with the majestic and triumphalist strains of a universal monarchy as Jesus's kingdom stretches from shore to shore. Indeed, even Victorian voices that contested this vision and agitated for such things as pacifism, an end to racial discrimination, universal suffrage, and even socialist values are plagued with an imperial residue. Hymns like this one, These Things Shall Be a Loftier Race by Symonds, which envisions a loftier race aspiring to arts in a loftier mold with mightier music. It's still about an empire, even if it's a kind of better empire. The same forces that bolstered the British Empire and the colonial project were also at play in hymn composition, hierarchizing a more elite and organ-centered musical style over those which were considered lowbrow. Tunes in a more popular genre like Friendship by Charles Converse for What a Friend We Have in Jesus were criticized for their vulgarity, sentimentality, emotionalism, and effeminacy. This criticism belies a snobbery against popular lower-class music styles in favor of rugged, majestic, dignified, masculine tunes typical of serious music composers at the end of the 19th century. This other end of the spectrum was also associated with more elite denominational and ecclesial contexts, the high church. Despite this internal hierarchy within Victorian hymnody on what comprised a good hymn, the fact remains that Victorian hymnody as a whole dominated and still dominates many hymnic canons. There are a number of complex social factors, which I'll leave for another time, that contributed to this flourishing of hymnody in Britain. I will mention, though, that the ways music was and is created, taught, performed, heard, experienced, and understood is hierarchically structured with European art music as the pinnacle in its most rugged, individualistic, white, and decidedly male version. The main point here, sorry about that, is that hymn singing was so widespread as a practice that it actually boosted the overall sense of imperial cultural identity and superiority. At its worst, British hymnody became a benchmark for superior cultural and religious expression, marginalizing, silencing, and even erasing other practices and expressions. I believe we need to examine where the pervasive authority given to these canons can still impede the full expression of complex cultural identities that are present in church contexts, and it continues to perpetuate theologies of empire. I've focused in this section on British Victorian hymnody, but a similar analysis could be done with respect to hymns from the USA. Let me wrap up this section with an illustration of this music coloniality in the culturally genocidal enactment of coloniality through singing in residential schools in Canada. In this photograph from Onion Lake, Saskatchewan, bodies are disciplined into the conformity of Anglican dress, ritual, and music. In Canadian residential schools, Christian ritual, including hymn singing, was used as a way to discipline and civilize the children in order to eradicate their sacred Indigenous practices, languages, and cultures. The positive benefits of singing notwithstanding, teaching singing in this manner was an attempt to turn children into white children, part of the project of taking the Indian out of the child, a project whose murderous violence was so starkly revealed again last summer with the discovery of the bodies of 215 Indigenous children in Kamloops, British Columbia, and 751 at the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan. And the search goes on. There are more bodies, but they're looking to find them. So all of this heaviness is not to say that all Victorian hymns ought to be thrown out of the window, as we'll soon see. But it is to say that we need to interrogate our tradition and have a hard look at it. The singing of Victorian hymnody is not always as straightforward as it seems. European hymns can be inverted or flipped by the people who sing them as they subvert theologies of empire and colonialism through singing. This leads us to the other aspects of a decolonizing stance, namely the recognition and affirmation of other ways of doing and knowing from the global south and from marginalized contexts in the global north, whether in music that rises up from communities or in the reclaiming of hymns from our inherited canons. Let's consider two hymns from these canons that have been transformed by the communities that sing them. Songs of Empire are flipped. The first is Victorian Mission Hymn from Greenland's Icy Mountains. I'm just going to sing verse 1, and I learned this, my mom still remembers this tune, so I learned it from her. From Greenland's icy mountains, from India's coral strand, where Afric's sunny fountains roll down their golden sand, from many an ancient river, from many a palmy plain, they call us to deliver their land from error's chain. By all accounts, From Greenland's Icy Mountains encapsulates the version of Christianity from the apex of English imperialism. It was penned reportedly in less than an hour by Anglican priest Reginald Heber in 1819 for an event to support the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. And it went on to become one of the most popular missionary hymns of all times. Heber, who wrote 57 other hymns, including Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, eventually became Bishop of Calcutta in 1823, where he reportedly was a compassionate leader. But the hymn epitomizes the colonialist values of his era, however noble his own intentions might have been. It is clothed in the evangelistic language of the 19th century that envisions a global triumphant Christianity. It perpetuates concepts like the civilizing mission, which were used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples in Canada and elsewhere. Let's take a quick look at excerpts from verses 2 and 3. So here you have the heathen in his blindness, and the original was that he wrote was savage, which was crossed out. And then this idea that some souls are lighted or enlightened with wisdom from on high, and others are benighted. It was a surprise to me when Bishop Mark MacDonald, the National Indigenous Bishop for the Anglican Church of Canada, showed me From Greenland's Icy Mountains in his psalms and hymns in the language of the Cree Indians. We have gotten together from time to talk about hymns and to share our love of congregational singing. On this occasion, I told him how I had stumbled on From Greenland's Icy Mountains in the hymnal that was used in residential schools. I know that hymn, he told me, and pulled out his well-worn volume. I asked him how it could have been sung in Indigenous communities. At his puzzled look, I showed him the English text, and he said, "That's bad," and I agreed. From Greenland's Icy Mountains is an easy target for someone like me who wants to expose coloniality and congregational singing. So I struggled to understand how this hymn could remain among the hymns that Mark MacDonald turns to in his well-thumbed book. It is possible to do a detailed post-colonial analysis using scholar Homi Bhabha's concept of mimicry to understand the repetition of colonial hymns as potentially subversive. Very briefly, those who are colonized, in this case, Indigenous people, can subvert the colonial agenda just by being who they are through the very act of their singing, which is, in Bhabha's words, almost the same but not quite, or almost the same but not white. But I think there's more going on here than just mimicry. Oppressed communities often outrightly invert or flip colonial tools so that they become instruments of resistance, refusing the role of passive victims. From Greenland's Icy Mountains, for instance, was translated into multiple Indigenous languages, including into Cree in the version that Bishop MacDonald knows. Such translated hymns were not just repetitions of coloniality or expressions of mimicry. In many ways, they actually became entirely different hymns. They became subversive ways of singing, even though the tune was preserved to some extent, and missionaries were involved in translation. But these hymns also embodied other ways of knowing outside the parameters of colonization. Through translation, the English meaning of From Greenland's Icy Mountains, in which a triumphalist, expansionist vision of what was understood as a superior Christianity with superior European Christians favored with the task of evangelizing, is actually flipped into a vision which emphasizes a collaborative relationship between the Creator and all of humanity and focuses on living well in the here and now. In verse 1, for instance, and your full translation is in the handout if you want to have a look at that. The line, they call us to deliver their land from error's chain, changes significantly in the Ojibwe translation, becoming, you who have heard us, have great mercy for that reason. In verse 2, the description of an exotic other in the original version gives way to a humanizing affirmation of the people. In the original English, the vile heathen man is blind to the lavish kindness of God's gifts. But in the Ojibwe, those who salute wood and stone live well. They are beautiful. Their beauty and living well is emphasized rather than the idea that they lack something because they are non-Christian. In this context, God's mercy is described as the immediate and intimate act of a loving creator rather than as a remote, superior, beneficent mercy bestowed from on high. I just want to mention here that the translation comes from Michael McNally, who wrote a fantastic book called Ojibwe Singers, which kind of traces this sort of in-between space between coloniality and another way of understanding the world. The original Ojibwe version of From Greenland's Icy Mountains is what Latin American decolonial thinkers, especially Walter Mignolo, call an act of epistemic disobedience, of knowing, being, and doing decolonially. It affirms other ways of knowing outside of what Europeans imposed on the rest of the world. It is outside the modern European framework of the English version, subversively expressing, affirming, and carrying Indigenous cultural ways. Mark MacDonald says that the hymn singing was the mode of resistance in which Indigenous languages and culture were carried. He says that culture went underground through hymns. He also says that the singing itself is just as important as the text. The slow, fervent style of hymn singing in many Indigenous communities is appreciated and evaluated, he says, for its passionate commitment and expression, rather than for technical proficiency and controlled vocal quality. This style of singing affirms dignity and beauty on its own terms in the ways Indigenous communities sing. They make the hymn their own. Theologically speaking, MacDonald says that underneath what we see and hear is a dynamic of life which is unveiled and released in singing. He says that hymn singing enables a different cosmovision, including an eschatology or a vision of earth and of heaven on earth, which is defiant because it is present in the here and now through singing. The third verse actually emphasizes this alternative cosmovision in the text. All of us who have wisdom, who have light, will you be discouraged or afraid to help people? Oh, restoration of Bima Dizuwen, tell the news everywhere, tell until everyone they have listened to you. In English, the focus is on bringing the light of the gospel, bringing salvation to men who are benighted. I had to look that up. It means intellectually and morally ignorant. In contrast, the Ojibwe version encourages all who are wise to help people. There's no distinction here between some who are enlightened and others. Rather, there's a sense that all people can be wise. Salvation is translated as Bima Dizuwen, a term which can be understood to refer to heavenly life, but it also refers to the here and now, to the good life, lived well, in proper relationship to human and non-human persons, akin to the Latin American notion of buen vivir, or good living. From Greenland's icy mountains is certainly an emblematic example of coloniality in hymns in its original English. Sung in its Ojibwe version by Indigenous communities, however, it expresses another way of knowing. It is a song of resistance, subversive not only in the theology expressed, but in the way it is sung, with the emphasis placed on heartfelt, passionate expression. I want to leave you with a couple of questions. Can you think of a time when a hymn has been flipped, or has the meaning for a particular hymn changed for you and why? So just hang on to those questions as we go through the rest of the webinar. Let's take a look at another hymn that has been flipped by the communities who sing it. Here's Elvis Presley. He won the first of 3 Grammys for the best sacred performance with this recording and popularized the song throughout the world. Let's listen to him.
Sing it, fellas.
When Christ shall come, we shall have acclamation to take me home. What joy shall fill my heart? Then I shall bow in humble adoration and there proclaim, oh my God, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art.
I'd like to take you to the Cuban context in March 2012, when I was asked to play the piano for the funeral of beloved Cuban theologian and professor, Maestro René Castellanos Morente, at the Seminario Evangélico de Teología de Matanzas in Cuba. To my surprise, the community sang How Great Thou Art. In the maestro's translation, Cuán grande tú, The more informal second person personal pronoun tu is used in the chorus to address God directly. Cuán grande tú, how great you. This informality is intensified by the choice of translation, which transgresses grammatical rules by foregoing the use of a verb in the sentence, while suggesting the affectionate and colloquial style of Cuban cultural expressions. The hymn was reconfigured by the community that sang it to become an expression of the faith and life of the community, as well as a tribute to the maestro and an expression of solidarity with each other. The most common English language version of this Swedish hymn, written by Carl Gustav Boberg in 1885, is a paraphrase by English Salvation Army missionary Stuart Hine. Hine encountered it in the Ukraine in the Russian translation of a German version of Boberg's text. Hine's version itself, How Great Thou Art, arrived in Anglo-North America in the mid-20th century. This version was popularized by Billy Graham's Crusades in London and Toronto in 1954 and 1955. I think my dad might have been at the 1955 Crusade. And subsequently, it was made popular around the world by Elvis Presley in the version we just heard. When it moved out of its context of origin, the song was literally transformed. Through interpretation and translation, its meaning shifted in relation to each new context which claimed it as its own, each iteration linguistically and culturally transformed. It is very unlikely that an imperial agenda was part of Boberg's original intention in writing O Great God. The 9-verse hymn celebrates the grandeur and beauty of creation and highlights God's saving grace and accompaniment through life's struggles. For instance, verse 1 begins by praising the God of creation, evoking the image of feminine wisdom, weaving the threads of life together at God's table for all creatures. The hymn, however, came to be used as a mechanism for Christian proselytization, especially in Hine's version, and has been associated with European and Anglo-North American missions and expansionism. Hine's text uses arcane and triumphalist language, which distances the singer from the divine and reinforces a hierarchical framework. The chorus of the original, then the soul bursts out in sound of praising, O great God, follows the inclusive communal imagery of the first verse. In Hine's translation, however, a different tone is adopted using deferential imperial English. Then sings my soul, my Savior God to thee, how great thou art, how great thou art. The latter is entangled with notions of a superior distance God, often associated with European versions of Christianity, which were intertwined with European colonialism. Christians became subjects invited into the imperial throne room of the culturally and racially superior divine emperor. How Great Thou Art in Hine's version also evinces coloniality by reinforcing notions of divine superiority and human depravity, so often used as an ideological tool by Christian colonizers to conquer and civilize. The accentuating of submission and meekness in the final line of the verse, then I shall bow in humble adoration, de-emphasizes Boberg's extensively creation-oriented text in which a cosmic vision of the heavens, the sun and the moon and the rest of creation is put forward. It was this translation with its much more triumphalist, imperially oriented vision which spread throughout the world. Admittedly, processes of relocation and translation do not always function to bolster empire, as we saw from Greenland's icy mountains. Coloniality is not reinscribed every time a community sings a colonial hymn, whether in its original language or in translation. As hymns are sung by marginalized community, they are re-signified. This is the colonial difference, where both the coloniality of power is enacted and where other ways of knowing become visible, where what I call border singing emerges. The singing of Maestro Castellano's version of this hymn at his funeral displays this kind of complex interplay between coloniality and resistance to coloniality. Another more common Spanish version of O Store Gut, Cuán Grande es Él, by Arturo Houghton, is sung throughout the Americas. His translation moves the hymn text back closer to its original meaning in Swedish. For instance, in verse 3, the emphasis rests on Jesus being sent to save out of God's divine love, in contrast to Hein's version, which emphasizes the atonement-oriented sacrifice of God through Jesus. A more ambiguous decolonizing theology, a kind of border theology, emerges in the more intimate language of these translations, which emphasize God's love and God's saving act on behalf of the poor and marginalized. A process of lived hermeneutics, as Nestor Medina proposes it, describes these dynamics, this interpretive process by which communities re-signify biblical texts, hymns, ritual acts, and other inherited traditions along liberationist lines. It takes into account performance practices and the context, especially the lived daily reality of the people singing and their felt response to it. Lived hermeneutics foregrounds lived experience as a means to interpret hymns on multiple levels, especially culturally and contextually. It moves beyond a literalist singing of hymns and establishes a dialogical relation whereby the believer's own social experience of marginalization creates the space for people to find themselves in the biblical story and in hymns. In other words, when it comes to singing, y en una cruz sufrió y por mí murió, and in the cross he suffered and died, the people are singing their story of suffering, marginalization, migration, and often premature death. Through lived hermeneutics, communities critique their present conditions of social marginalization, look ahead to the future promise of liberation, and establish new interpretive relations for understanding their faith in the context of their ongoing reality. The other kind of affirmation of singing that is part of a decolonizing stance is a lifting up of songs from the global South. I first heard this next song at the end of an Easter morning service at the Anglican community of Holy Trinity in downtown Toronto, where I was the music director. A man named Guillermo approached me with a glint in his eye from the community of San Esteban, our sister Latino congregation. He told me he had a song he thought I might like and sang this. I'm going to sing a verse and I'm going to trust that you're all singing along with me, okay? Si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo canto como David. Please join me. Si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo canto como David. Yo canto, yo canto, yo canto como David. Yo canto, yo canto, yo canto como David. So we should be up singing and dancing. So let's sing the verse about jumping, yo salto. And I just want you all to jump in your seats a bit. Si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo salto como David. Si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo salto como David. Yo salto, yo salto, yo salto como David. Yo salto, yo salto, yo salto como David. Thanks for singing. I'm guessing you did. Here's the version. Oh, in conversations with friends, I've learned that this corrito has been sung in Cuba, Guatemala, Argentina, and elsewhere for many years, even in French Africa. Here's the version that appeared in the Mennonite World Conference book in 1978, and then again in 1990. And let's have a brief listen to one version.
Si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo danzo como David. Si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo danzo como David. Yo danzo, yo danzo, yo danzo como David. Yo danzo, yo danzo, yo danzo como David. Si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo danzo como David. Si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo danzo como David.
The song, by all accounts, had its origins in Latin America from the tradition of poor and marginalized community contexts. Many of the communities that sing corritos like this understand ownership as something that belongs to community. I don't want to get into trouble here, so I want to emphasize that copyright is important, but it is also important to honor where a song comes from, whether we know the person who wrote it or whether it rises out of community. In his writing on Latin American Pentecostal corritos like El Espíritu de Dios, Pablo Sosa observes that such songs were usually not annotated but transmitted orally and spontaneously in a worship context, and their authors not identified, either out of respect for the biblical text or because the song was a collective creation or melody already familiar to the communities. This corrito displays an intensely physical, sensual, emotive, relational, and communal liturgical activity, which has great potential to usher in an experience of the divine, especially by involving actions in the singing to embody the words as we just experienced, albeit via Zoom and in our seats. Its textual simplicity allows the focus to shift from traditional approaches which analyze text to an approach that affirms the holistic inclusion of the entire being. Our voices vibrate in our bodies, and our bodies reverberate with the shared task of sounding the body of Christ, explicitly animated in this song by the Spirit of God, which moves in us, el Espíritu de Dios que se mueve en mí. These qualities embody a break from values which privilege Eurocentric Enlightenment emphases on written, individual, rational, and intellectual, as on the written, individual, rational, and intellectual as superior and universal modes of thinking, being, and doing. The song affirms what decolonial thinkers call another way of knowing, which is instead embodied, emotive, communal, rising up from the oral tradition on the underside of modernity. It is senti pensar, to quote Arturo Escobar, a thinking that is felt. When singers move, feel, and know together, the very act of singing changes. It is re-signified. It becomes a place for doing theology, a kind of border singing along the lines of what Latin American decolonial thinkers call border thinking. Of course, many in our churches live in the dangerous reality of a borderland existence in context of dehumanization and discrimination, of violence, and at times even death. The borders of our lives are present when we sing. They are present yet porous. At any given moment, they can be permeable, fluid, or shifting. They depend on the terms of present geopolitical, social, national realities, which leave many people outside the centers of power. Some of us can easily cross back and forth, and others cannot. Guillermo, who taught me this song, invited me into a border space when he shared it with me. Yet the border between Canada and El Salvador was closed to him when his refugee claim was denied and he was deported. The story of this particular song, this other way of singing, this border song is complicated. In 1996, this corrito was recorded and copyrighted by gospel musician Fred Hammond as The Spirit of the Lord, inspiring the title of the album on which it appeared, The Spirit of David. So let's listen to a little bit of that recording.
I said, RC, are you ready? Put your hands together. Come on. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon my heart. I will dance like David danced. The
When it became a product through the engines of the USA music industry, it proliferated throughout the world and can now be heard on YouTube in a variety of versions. So let's get a taste of a few of those versions. This is a call and response version by Anil Kant of India. And here is a light pop version by the GKBJ group in Indonesia. This is from the church called the Batak Christian Protestant Church that has a membership of 4,500,000.
Di dalamku, ku kan menari sertidak menari. Bila roh Allah ada di dalamku, ku kan menari seperti tidak menari. Ku kan menari, ku kan menari, ku kan menari seperti tidak menari. Ku kan menari, menari, ku kan menari seperti tidak menari.
And finally, a Scandinavian metal version.
When the Spirit of the Lord comes upon my heart, I will dance like David danced. When the Spirit of the Lord comes upon my heart, I will dance like David danced. I will dance, dance, dance like David danced. I will dance, dance, dance like David danced.
So, and I invite you to go on YouTube, look up this song. There's tons more versions. When the song moved from being an anonymous oral artifact to a recorded commodity, its ownership, at least in terms of copyright and the resulting financial gains, was effectively co-opted from its communities of origin by a successful North American gospel singer. The song's appropriation around the world is but a sampling of complex webs of ongoing colonization in music. Another facet of musicaloniality, which here includes the wanton appropriation of all other music traditions without regard for the context of their origin, along with systems which insist that European and Anglo-North American musical ways are superior, like in our hymn traditions. On display are consumer, capitalist, extractivist methods and approaches adapted to the reproduction of musical pieces from the global South. Basically, the musical gifts of the people, this other way of singing and being in the world, are no longer secure. The movement around the globe of El Espíritu de Dios, including its appropriation in a variety of contexts, raises significant ethical issues. Unless and until there is a relationship between song practitioners, their communities, and the marginalized communities to whom the song originally belonged, practices of accountability remain theoretical and abstract. Michael Hahn suggests that singing songs from around the world can be said to help us sing and pray for the sake of the world. I wholeheartedly agree. Still, the fact that we are often disconnected from the lived reality and the people of those contexts can suggest a lack of integrity in our engagement. This is especially the case when a person or institution benefits from the reproduction of the knowledges, here in the form of uncopyrighted songs from the global South. S.T. Kimbrough is unequivocal about these ethical implications. He says that you honor another culture and its song when you take great care with copyright registrations. Honor the origin of songs. Do not violate copyright. What is clear to me is that when El Espíritu de Dios is sung from below, understood as belonging to the community, it offers an alternative which emerges from the oral tradition from the heart of a community's life and experience. El Espíritu de Dios, like from Greenland's icy mountains and How Great Thou Art, is not evaluated by these communities through an analysis of text and tune, but by what meaning is made through the singing of the song on the part of the community and by how people feel and how they experience the movement of the Holy Spirit. Particular communities have taken on ownership of the song, shaping their own identities as Christians, making meaning in their own local contexts. As such, these three examples can embody acts of hope, other ways of knowing, and the celebration of other people's cultural traditions, which defy forces that oppress and the ongoing pervasiveness of coloniality. For me, singing El Espíritu de Dios drew me into relationship with the people who sing the song and contributed to my own conversion through a reorientation to another way of being. It invited me to wrestle with deeply troubling ethical issues by singing with people in a decolonial key. In this space, singing is a way to do theology. Our singing is about who we are and who we want to become as active agents of a liberating praxis, proclaiming what is and what ought to be the already and not yet of the reign of God. Before we open up the floor for questions, I have a brief postscript. The language of decolonization has gained prominence lately, not only in grassroots movements, but in academic settings and in churches. Everybody's talking about it. Each iteration of decolonizing signifies different locations, different contexts, different experiences. Because these currents and ideas have been taken up in the theological and ecclesiological realm, my plea to you is that you use the language with care, attentive to where it comes from, especially the people whose lives are at stake, whose struggles undergird the language we use. I wrote an article for the Canterbury Dictionary that's on your handout that outlines some of these threads in case you're interested in following up more. So here, for example, are some of the threads. In Canada, liberation theologies from Latin America and elsewhere, including Black feminists, womanist, mujerista, evangelista, Minjung, and the list goes on. Coming out of the same context as Latin American liberation theologies is Latin American decolonial thinking, a group of scholars from Latin America who respond to the legacy of conquest that began in 1492. Post-colonial theories analyze the dynamic between the colonizer and the colonized, especially in the realm of the cultural and mostly from Asian contexts. In South Africa, there are strong movements of decolonizing and Africanizing, especially in post-secondary institutions. And in the USA, decolonizing is increasingly being used by Black communities to come to terms with the history and oppression of Black peoples, as well as by Indigenous and Latino communities, among others. This is but a sampling of the currents. There are more. My point is that each anti-colonial, decolonizing, or liberating current has its own lineage, social, political, and cultural context, grassroots movements and struggles, intellectual frameworks, etc. They're not the same, so it's important to understand where they come from and to be careful with the language we use. And I also admit that there's a messiness, ambiguity, and fluidity between each of these currents. For example, my own approach draws in part from Latin American decolonial thinkers who, along with grassroots communities, church activists, and liberation theologians, were responding to their contexts, including gross global economic inequities and imperial interference in the region. They rejected the notion of developmentalism and recast their story using dependency theories. Decolonial thinkers argue that modernity began with the conquering of the Americas in 1492, which actually financed the Enlightenment. In other words, the conquering of the Americas enabled Europe's ascendancy to the global economic scene. For them, modernity, colonialism, and capitalism are interwoven. The underside of this is the brutal exploitation, enslaving, and in some cases, annihilation of Indigenous and African peoples in the Americas. Key concepts include coloniality, epistemic disobedience, other ways of knowing, colonial difference, border thinking, etc. And all of these ideas from these different currents are being taken up widely in church context by leaders, teachers, and practitioners of global song. We are beginning to sing in a decolonial key. For instance, at the Hymn Society conference in 2019, we heard from Mark Childs, a Native American activist and theologian, and in 2020 from Alicia Jones, who presented powerfully on decolonizing song, drawing on her own Black roots and culture. A final word. What has been interwoven in my presentation today, at least I hope so, are some principles that are implicit, and I'll take a moment now to make them explicit. This is in addition to the three main tasks of interrogating our canons, that's 1, 2, affirming the ways communities make their own meanings through singing, and 3, lifting up songs that rise up from the global south. So here are some other implicit principles. First, decolonizing congregational song is rooted in relationship with each other, within our churches, and with the communities whose songs we sing. We need to learn each other's stories. That's a way of honoring where songs come from. The people whose songs we sing can be honored by sharing stories, hiring leaders from those communities, and figuring out appropriate ways to remunerate communities for their songs. Decolonizing congregational singing is attentive to power. We must interrogate the power we have as ministers, teachers, and song leaders and be willing to share. In some cases, we need to give it up, and in others, we need to claim it, depending on where we're coming from. Let me be clear, though, that for some of us, including me, it can mean giving up power. Following Jesus, we can relinquish our power and privilege to make space for another. Indeed, it means being open to conversion to another person, another cultural tradition, another way of doing things. Decolonizing congregational singing means making space for diversity, not just occasionally, but all the time. What if we made space for music from beyond Europe 25% of the time, or 50%, or 75%, as Dr. Aylmer urged us to do in her keynote last year? Decolonizing congregational singing means confronting systems that maintain power and privilege. Finally, decolonizing congregational singing means leading the churches to another way of being in a decolonial key. This work of trying to figure out how to actually decolonize congregational singing can help us to think about how to decolonize church structures, as well as the theological task more broadly. It takes us into our bodies, into the realm of rootedness and practical theology, into relationship. Liberating praxis for congregational singing lifts up the experience and cultural traditions of the people as a place for doing theology and is unapologetic about seeking transformation. Here, I want to applaud the Hymn Society for plunging itself into this work, for making spaces for the voices of the marginalized included and excluded. Let's keep going. We need to not only ask what we are singing, who is singing and leading, and how we are singing, but also what is at the center of our tradition, how our institutions structured to perpetuate power imbalance and coloniality. Friends, our singing embodies the glorious sounding of the body of Christ, but we must also wrestle with the troubling incommensurability between the people singing and the forces of empire, which are always and already at work. Thank you. And I'm going to invite Brian to jump back in, and I think we'll have some questions. I'll catch my breath here for a moment.
Becca, thank you so much. Every time I get to hear you present or have a conversation with you, I find myself being invited into a much deeper understanding of history and who I am and how all of this is supposed to work. So we have a lot of questions, which does not always happen on webinars, I might add. So kudos to you. For inspiring lots of questions. So friends, but there's still time to put things into the Q&A if you would like. But let's jump right in, assuming you've taken a breath and
I've taken a breath.
Yourself.
I haven't, my energy's still kind of hyped up, so I haven't actually read the questions.
Perfect.
So I'm going to rely
okay.
on you to
I'll read them to you.
And then I'll do my best.
I'll read them to you. Let's see. Well, this one's at the top and it has received 2 upvotes, which is why it's at the top. So we'll answer this one. So Sharon Reinbot says, can we have some examples of hymns currently sung that are not obviously racist, as in From Greenlands that you shared earlier, and can be flipped by even those of us whose ancestors are white colonists? I have flipped This Is My Father's World, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and Immortal, Invisible, God Only Wise. There are subtle patriarchal, anthropocentric references that we need to address as we decolonize. Can you address these?
Well, I can try. So yes, and I want to say again, usually I say this a couple times and I only said it once, but I just want to be clear that I'm not saying we ought to toss out Victorian hymnody. It's an amazing body of hymnody that I love. Okay, but it's a specific cultural hymnody that needs to not be the center of what we do, but a partner alongside other traditions. So just to say that at the get-go, What a Friend We Have in Jesus is a great example. So maybe let me focus on that. And I think that's a really good example of a hymn that you could kind of toss out. I would kind of be inclined to toss it out because it's, for my personal taste, overly pietistic, and it also sinks into this kind of notion of depraved sinfulness. On the other hand, I'm going to give you an example of I have experienced that song sung by South African people at a funeral and Indigenous communities, where for them it's an affirmation of their dignity and humanity, and there's no reason it can't be that for a European-based congregation as well. For instance, it's widely sung in working class contexts throughout North America and elsewhere by white congregations, and it affirms dignity there too. So this is not saying that all sort of European hymnody is bad. I really want to make sure that is not the message I'm giving here. So I think we can flip it. And I think it's important not to have a knee-jerk reaction and toss something out the window, but to sit with it and to sit with it in community. Have conversations about your hymns. Do a hymn study instead of a Bible study and look at it and find out what it means to your people. How along the lines of Nestor Medina's lived hermeneutics, how do congregations, how do particular hymns affirm their lived experience? How do they accompany people in their struggle? It's important that we dignify our hymns by understanding what they mean, where they come from, and what they mean to us. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks. Yeah, let's keep going. We've got more, like 7 questions now in the Q&A, so they keep coming in, which is great. Catherine Williams says, my understanding and thou is that they were originally informal pronouns without the formal association that we have today. or that they have today. Can anyone corroborate on this? And then Baz, B-A-Z, I don't know what that stands for, but says, I have an interest in queer theology and have an interest in pronouns. I have found Reverend Ken Collins' website a good source for this material with many thee thou examples. Should it be of interest? And then there's a link. Anything to add to that, Becca, about the thee thou?
So that's a good question, and I'm going to have to confess that I'm not as much of a linguist as I would like to be at this moment. So I'm not 100% sure. And I also think that there's something like when Elvis Presley sings it or other people sing it, there's something powerful in giving yourself to the power of a mighty God, right? Mm. So I don't want to diminish that spiritual experience, but so it's, there's kind of, in a sense, what I'm arguing for is multiple ways of understanding a hymn text and a hymn tune and the way we sing it. Because that's what's going on. You have three people in a room and you have three different interpretations of a hymn and three different experiences, right? So thee and thou, Baz, shout out to Baz. She's from Alberta and a student of mine. But the question of pronoun, I had not thought about thee and thou in terms of pronouns, but that's an interesting take on it. And it's definitely worth exploring more. So that in some cases, and there are different, by the way, English translations. In the Covenant hymnal, there's a translation, and in the New Century hymnal, there are other translations that go, because actually Stuart Hines' version is not a translation, it's a version, it's an interpretation. And those other two hymnals have direct translations of Boberg's original text, and they're worth looking at because his text is very creation oriented and talks about all of God's creatures at the table. And so, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't sing, "Oh, sings my soul, my Savior God to thee." Like, that might be the version that your community needs to dig into to praise God and to experience the divine.
Thank you. Every time.
So sorry, Brian, but let me just say further research needed. And I look forward to ongoing conversations about thee and thou and pronouns.
Someone researched that and proposed a sectional for the 2023 conference, which Becca is co-chairs because it's going to be in Canada. So there you go. If you do a sectional, if someone proposes a sectional on that, Becca will be one of the ones reviewing the sectional proposals. So it seems like a shoo-in. All right. Not to make any promises. David Harrison asks a question that we pretty much get every time we have any kind of presentation on this type of topic or spirituals or any kind of, quote, world music global song. But it deserves to keep being asked because it's an important question, and it got 3 upvotes. So it's at the very top of the queue, which means other people are interested in this as well. Are there songs that our predominantly white middle-class communities ought not to sing because they are not our songs to sing? How do we deal with world music, spirituals, and so on? So this is essentially asking the appropriation question. Mm-hmm. How do we avoid appropriation?
Okay, that's a complicated question. and
you have 2 minutes.
Do I really only have 2 minutes?
No. I'm just kidding. You take your time.
And there's not a straightforward answer. So I guess I would go back to the principles that I talked about at the end and emphasize the principle of relationship. So there might be songs we ought not to sing. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there might be songs that come out of the particular experience of a community that unless you understand where that community is coming from, you shouldn't sing it because you might dishonor it. So the way to get around that is to have a relationship with either person or people who wrote the song and ask their permission. That's critical. There are other ways, and I know, Brian, you wrote an article in the Hymn about this, and I wrote an article for the GIA Quarterly on singing Latin American music, and kind of some tips about appropriating appropriately, if I could say that. In other words, not misappropriating, because we're appropriating music all the time, right? So it's about, first of all, honoring where a song comes from. So not just dipping your toes into it and then dipping out. So, including communities that, including the community whose song you're singing in your prayers, talking about it in your sermon. So deepening your connection, even if you're not directly connected to the community, telling where it comes from, what the context is, learning about the song. Even better than that is seeking people from that community to help lead the song, or to work with your choir, or so that you're actually building an engagement with folks, and paying them, right? So the other thing you can do is, and this is tricky, and there are a number of us who are kind of working on this, the ethical implications of this, but not all communities are governed by copyright impulses or laws. And so how can you actually remunerate a community for using its song? That's another kind of thing that you can explore. So, but I guess what I would say is that for me, and I've made mistakes, so this is kind of perilous territory, but it's important to ask permission and to honor where a song comes from, to pay copyrights, to try to work in partnership with other people. Those are all kind of principles that I think help with it. And there might be times where we shouldn't sing a song, or I haven't done this, but I've wondered if there might be times where we should be silent and penitential. Like today we were going to sing this song, but we're going to actually have a moment of repentant silence instead, remembering the suffering of this community. I don't know. I mean, I've wondered about that. So there's sort of a whole range of potential responses. And I just think it depends on your community. It depends on the song. It depends on the community whose song it is, and kind of navigating all of that. And all of that takes time. So doing this work, I think it's really, really good work, but it takes time. It's risky. And as I said, I've made mistakes. I've sung a song that has hurt somebody. And I've shied away from singing songs that maybe I should have sung. So it's a tricky thing.
So the next question actually directly relates to it. So maybe we could just piggyback off of everything you just said. Gordon is asking, because of most hymns have a Welsh, French, German-ish origin that we find in our repertoire today. And then there's some tunes of African and Central American origin, but he doesn't know of any, or they don't know of any tunes of Aboriginal origins. Would it be helpful to have tunes from Aboriginal origin, or would that be cultural appropriation? And I guess the answer is, have you built relationships with Aboriginal peoples? Have you had this conversation with them? And then going down that route rather than stopping at that first question.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Brian.
Is that right?
Yes.
I'm trying to synthesize what you just said and turn it into a practical application. Thanks to Gordon's question.
But in fact, there are songs that are written down. So, and I know in the Canadian context, through relationship, some songs have been transcribed in in More Voices. There's a couple of songs, and I have actually had the privilege to get to know and work with the authors of one of those songs in Saskatoon, Joseph Natauhau, who's a Plains Cree knowledge keeper, and there's a song of his in More Voices, which is the supplement to Voices United, which is the Canadian the United Church of Canada's hymn book. So there are some, many in grade is kind of one, and there's also another one, the Hallelujah. Anyhow, there are some out there, but I think that Brian's right. Building relationships is important. And one of the things I've learned in conversation with Mark McDonald is that a favorite repertoire of many Indigenous communities is bluegrass gospel hymns. So that can also be said to be, in some sense, representative of Indigenous communities' heart songs. And I would totally recommend Michael McNally's book, Ojibwe Singers, if you're interested in Indigenous singing. And it's a beautifully written book, and it talks about how Indigenous communities have claimed old hymns, including from Greenland's icy mountains, actually, as ways of bringing back their culture and relearning their language. So it's a fascinating study of that. And I see David Harrison's comment here. Yes, there's a new supplement coming out with the Anglican Church of Canada, and they will. We've done our best to follow an ethical process in putting that together, and that will be presented in Washington this coming summer. So, a little plug for next summer's conference. And I just also want to say that one of the things that I would love, that is not really common practice yet in hymnals, is to provincialize Europe. So when a song is German or English, to say that it's German and English, and celebrate German and English or French or Swedish culture, right? To say where it comes from. If we're going to do that for songs from the global South, let's do it for songs from the global North as well, and celebrate those cultures. It's not about dissing European or Anglo-North American culture. It's about celebrating it all, right?
Yeah. I've thought at many times during these types of conversations, as I learn more and more about this, is that while we have to celebrate and include a diversity of songs, we also, at the same time, we have to deconstruct the idea of whiteness, but it has to be a both and. We can't start there necessarily, but we have to do it along with all this other work, because white is such a stupid thing that we've created. And like, what the heck is white? It's German or English or Welsh or whatever.
Yeah, and it's complicated. I mean, and there's one of the things that I do actually in my book is untangle the threads of our stories. So all of our or many of our backgrounds are quite complicated, and whether we're racialized or whether we're kind of white. And it's one of the ways to approach each other and be in relationship with each other is to tell the stories of who our ancestors are. And that's a way of tackling presumptions about what our cultures are and what our preferences are and what our heart songs are, is to start to share about who we are and what songs matter to us.
Well, let's end with, there's one more, there are other questions, but we are approaching the 1 hour and 30 minute mark. And so I thought we would end with a question from Heidi Lang, who asks, where does contemporary music fit into all of this? Is it inherently white? Do you have suggestions for integrating cross-culturally in services, both culturally diverse and contemporary flavors? So getting into the kind of CCM conversation, which is funny because the classic dichotomy is like traditional and contemporary, right? This is the one we always kind of battle against, and the kind of the thing that breaks the mold there is world music, right? Because it's not either one of those, right? But then it's like, and that's what we've been talking about, is kind of decolonizing and unpacking that, because that's not particularly helpful either. So now that third part of this weird little triangle is being brought into the conversation, which is why I thought we'd end with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, it's a really nice segue to the next webinar, which is not that Adam has to answer this question necessarily, but
He's here. I can promote him, and we can just go ahead and get into his webinar if you want.
So he's going to be talking about contemporary music, but the last song that I talked about, and in some senses, Elvis's version of How Great Thou Art might be considered kind of contemporary, right? For sure, El Espíritu de Dios is, and it's not white, right? Like Fred Hammond, who's Black, recorded it. So in the kind of Black gospel music tradition, and it's also recorded in many versions in Spanish, and by Scandinavian metal bands or whatever. So there's some sense in which it all crosses, and I have not done a lot of research into sort of thinking through the decolonizing of contemporary music, but I think it would be well worth doing. And I think that some of those, my suspicion is that there would be some borders between so-called white contemporary music and other contemporary music, and that might need to be broken down, but also that some of those probably have been broken down in ways that might surprise us. So I think the same theological analysis would need to happen in terms of text, and then we would want to think about the music as well. And so I think you could take this kind of work and apply it in a contemporary music context. But I mean, the main thing is that with all of this, it's like, we need, in my opinion, we need to do something to do this analysis, to take our hymns and our songs seriously for the ways that they form us badly and form us well, and that it's never what it seems, right? Like, so that something that we think, oh, this is terrible, we got to ditch this, might be the beloved song of a particular community that we need to give a second listen to, and second analysis or third analysis. So yeah, okay, good.
Well,
Adam's gonna deal with it, he says.
Adam put in the chat that he'll deal with it, so that's taken check.
Excellent. I think we're just about there. Brian, I wanted to say that I've enjoyed talking about these issues in a podcast with you and with Marcel.
I was going to talk about that, yeah.
And I just wanted to say that in a bid to promote what the good work of the Hymn Society, that next summer there's some fabulous keynote speakers and hymn festivals, and also there's some interesting sectionals. And Marcel and I enjoyed talking to each other so much about decolonizing in this podcast that we are actually doing a sectional where we're going to go to liberation theologies, which have inspired both of us and which both of us love a lot, and talk about how that informs our practice as church musicians and scholars.
And I put in the link in the chat there for the first episode. It's a 2-episode podcast, so it's like 2 hours of conversation, primarily between Becca and Marcel, who are the experts on this, not me, although I was there to say ridiculous things and keep it light. But it's a great podcast, and indeed the other episodes of that podcast are wonderful as well. So check it out. It's called Practicing Gospel.
Shout out to David Rayburn for that.
That's right, David Rayburn. And the other thing I was going to say that you've already said, again, you're just so good at promoting things, is that the conference this summer is, we're really trying to live into this idea of decolonization and celebrating diversity, and the committee that put together this centennial conference, which was going to be a joint international conference, which we've done every 7 years with HSGBI, the British Hymn Society, and then IAHA, the German Central European Hymn Society. We've turned it into a much larger gathering that hopefully feels much more equal globally. We'll have representatives from Japan, Nigeria, Argentina, so many different places around the world that we hope will have just a wonderful place of meeting together and celebrating together and learning with each other. So I hope you'll come to the conference and help us live out what Becca's been talking about and help us wrestle with these things. So Becca, thank you so much for doing this webinar. And I will encourage you all once again, like Mike said at the beginning, get Becca's book and read it. It's wonderful. And you can have a book on your shelf that says Flipping the Songbird. So that's always a good conversation starter.
I'm just going to stick my personal email in the chat because I realize we didn't get to every question. So if somebody wants to write me with their question, we can have a bit of a chat online. So there it is.
All right. Becca's email is in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for your participation in this webinar. If you missed it, or if you know of anyone who missed it, or if you want to come back and see it, the archive will be available within a couple of days, and we'll send an email out to the registration list letting you know when that is available. Becca, be well, stay warm up there in Saskatoon, and we'll see you all next time.
Hang on, Brian. I didn't put the email in the. I sent it to you. Okay, there it goes to everybody. Sorry.
Now
about
it's
that,
in the
folks.
chat, but you can also email office at the Hymn Society, and if you need to get in contact with Becca, and don't grab it before I clicked in webinar here. So thank you all very much, and take care.
Thanks, Brian.
Bye-bye.